The Old Testament incident recorded in Numbers 21 is often seen as confusing or obscure, even unimportant. Many Christians choose to move on. There's nothing to see here, except that Jesus makes a point of it. The exchange with Nicodemus in John's Gospel in chapter 3 deals with it, and it leads to what is called the gospel in miniature. So the bronze serpent deserves a closer look than we might otherwise give it. Israel is en route to the promised land, and they decide to take a detour around a human obstacle, and it shows a lack of faith in God's ability to continue with them. We find them in the desert grumbling again, and their grumbling is immobilizing. They spoke against God, they spoke against Moses. There is a midrash associated with this particular passage. And midrashes are either stories or embellishments that usually give a different perspective and maybe bring some clarity to the story or the illustration involved. The focus here of the midrash, at least, is on manna, the food that God gave to the Israelites, a special gift. But it's here that the Israelites call it detestable and miserable food. Well, the midrash says that manna has no taste of its own. It is in the mouth, you might say, of the beholder. If you wanted, it would taste like chocolate cake every time you had it. It is only from Satan in the garden that we're told that everything that Satan would eat, everything that the serpent would eat, would taste like dust in his mouth. And so the midrash makes a point that those who find the gift of God, the bread of God, to taste earthy or dusty, are receiving it as the serpent would have in the garden. What we have going on here, according to the midrash, is the same old rebellion. God is trying to heal the rift with God's people, especially Israel. And they are not only holding on to Egypt, but to something much older and much more sinister, the rebellion of the Garden of Eden. The way of the serpent, however, will come back to bite you. And it did come back to bite the Israelites as they stopped amid their journey in the desert. The snakes that bite the Israelites, even kill them in the desert, are of their own making and of their own choosing. The snakes are referred to as seraphs. They become God's avenging angels. They carry the divine message that a better choice is available by God's grace. Even these, left in God's hands, can be used for good. Moses is told to make a serpent out of bronze. This should embarrass Jews. It suggests idolatry. It should raise revulsion for almost all of humanity. Going back to this time and beyond, there is, shall we say, a dislike of snakes. And this focuses on snakes. But then again, God can bring good out of anything. So what was meant for evil, what was meant as part of rebellion in the desert, becomes an instrument of salvation. Those who gaze upon the serpent and see not evil and rebellion and separation, but rather see the grace of God at work, those people are healed. The venomous people are healed of their own venomous ways, not by an embarrassing bronze snake, but by the healing hand of God. I'll note here that the bronze serpent was kept by the Israelites for a long period of time. It was given a place, an honored place, as a reminder, even in the temple, until it became a problem in the time of King Hezekiah, and it was eventually destroyed. This idea of something meant to be evil and embarrassing, which becomes a source of salvation, becomes important in John's Gospel. In referring to the bronze serpent incident, Jesus himself says that the Son of Man too must be lifted up. He will be lifted up on a cross. This is a symbol of cruel torture, of criminality, of shame, and of powerlessness. The crucified was stripped, exposed, elevated, lifted up, treated to a long death. Usually other indignities were perpetrated as well. And so who in their right mind would want to identify himself or herself with crucifixion and with the crucified? Exactly. Initially, the embarrassment and the gruesome sight had the desired effect. But for his mother and a few other women and young John, Jesus was alone as he hung exposed on the cross. On Good Friday, there was nothing of what would later be called John's theology of crucifixion exaltation. On that first Good Friday, Jesus' followers were ashamed and they were absent. After the resurrection, Jesus' followers regrouped. They began to realize that there was no shame in the cross, not for Jesus and not for them. The only shame in the cross was for the warped minds that had conceived of this inhuman torture, and for the corrupt and the ungodly who had placed Jesus there. They started to see the connection which Jesus had made with the bronze serpent. Jesus had to be lifted up so that the sin perpetrated against him could be exposed in all of its ugliness, so that his love could be seen in all its beauty by contrast and above the ugliness. Christians started to embrace the cross. This was a nightmare for Jesus' crucifiers. They spoke of Jesus' crucifixion as a good thing, as the Friday of his death became Good Friday. They spoke of it even as a necessary thing. If some restitution was going to be made with the people of God. They started fashioning crucified Jesuses out of bronze themselves, started parading them on poles during worship. Condemnation? That didn't come from God. It didn't come from God's ways. It came from people, not from God. It was the result of a from within process, a process of non-belief in the light leading to works of darkness. The snake being held on a pole and Jesus being held up on a cross were both about salvation, about saving us from ourselves, from the old rebellion that continues within our souls and our hearts. They were about exposing our darkness to the light so that we could be healed of that which would kill us spiritually. Through Jesus, God seeks to save the world and its inhabitants. Our action can help or to hinder that process. God's love, not condemnation, is the dynamic principle for our salvation and that of the world as well. So the Son of Man must be lifted up, and by the grace of God, we are all raised up with Christ in a new relationship with God our Father. Thanks be to God. Amen.